I am Kasra Fard, and this is Project Scope Management Part 2. When a project is initiated, one of the first tasks that a PM has is to identify stakeholders. The stakeholders are people or organizations who can impact the project negatively or positively, or the project can leave a positive or negative impact on them. A stakeholder's expectations will have to be directly managed by the project manager. However, different stakeholders will require different levels of attention. PMs tend to categorize the stakeholders based on a stakeholder's level of influence on the project and interest in the project. These two factors will help identify how the project manager should communicate with the stakeholders and address their expectations and needs. In other words, the influence versus interest will be the tool of choice to prioritize the stakeholders and in turn their needs, expectations, and communications. This diagram demonstrates how influence versus interest categorization works. In these 4 quadrants, we will see that the stakeholders can be categorized into 4 different groups, from high interest, high influence group all the way down to low interest, low influence. As an example, stakeholders that they fall into the first quadrant, including the sponsor, the project manager, and many of the C-level chief executives at the organization and corporation, their needs and expectations should be part of the project scope and should be managed through the scope directly. Every project has one or more project champions. The more allies a project has, the higher the chances or probability of its success. We can never be 100% certain that a project will be completed on budget and within the planned schedule, no matter how experienced the project manager is, especially if the success of a project is defined as a function of its budget, schedule, and scope. Projects are fraught with risks. Risks are uncertain events that can positively and negatively impact the project. By definition, the nature of projects will make their completion on time and budget an uncertain event. To improve the odds of success, project managers tend to look for those who can champion for the project. The project champion is not a role for which we can hire a person. Of course, some organizations will try to assign a person as a champion. But champions and championing for projects will work best if the people who are championing that are naturally interested in the project's success. So, how do we find champions for our projects? If you look at the diagram that we had before, we can surmise that by understanding the needs of the stakeholders in quadrants 1 and 2 and ensuring the needs of those, as much as possible, are addressed in the project scope, depending on how much we can help to grow the interest of those stakeholders in the project, they become more and more supportive of the project, and in many cases, even more than the project its sponsor. That's how we can have more champions. And again, the more champions we have, the more probability of the success. Part of the project charter and part of the project stakeholder management plan is something called the RACI. The RACI stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. For a task, resources are responsible for execution. Some of the resources are accountable for its success, are consulted on the success of the task and the requirements of it, or they need to be kept informed on the progress of the task. To create a RACI chart or a RACI diagram, the PM lists the stakeholders, which include the project resources as well, and assign them to the project main tasks. Then the PM will identify whether the stakeholders are responsible for the execution, accountable for the success, are to be consulted, or kept informed. When creating the RACI, one needs to remember that one person can only be accountable for a task. You cannot have multiple people being accountable for the success of a task. For the execution, on the other hand, you can have multiple people being responsible for the execution. Multiple people can be consulted or be kept informed. Different persons can wear different hats for one task, meaning one person can be responsible, at the same time accountable for the same task. As we can see in this table, the business analyst is consulted and kept informed for communications, whereas the software engineer is accountable and responsible for requirements gathering. One thing in terms of the charter that I'd like to talk about is the level of authority that project managers have. Project managers generally have very low level of authority. They negotiate with functional managers to obtain resources and will continue to negotiate with various stakeholders to keep the resources and ensure the resources are not being pulled into other projects and initiatives. After all, company resources are limited and the list of requirements quite long. That means PM's level of authority remains quite low. In some organizations, especially organizations that have well-defined processes and are mature, the authorities of a PM is very well defined, and those responsibilities cannot be easily changed. Still, regardless of the organizational maturity level, the PM can always request for more authority in the project charter. Of course, the sponsor and other main stakeholders can decide whether or not the requested authority can be granted, but there is no harm in asking. To read more, head over to management-business.blogspot.com, where the script for this tip has been documented, as well as books that I have used to prepare for this: Cost and Value Management in Projects, An Introduction to Project Management, as well as the PMBOK Guide.